Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and enjoy the following story. For the past 5 years, Frank and I have been the only two in the house. It wasn't easy for my wife to carry him to term. Her life had been filled with close calls and near-death experiences as a result of chronic health conditions. She had been told by every doctor she had ever seen that she would never be able to conceive. Even though she tried to put on a brave face, her true thoughts were clearly visible on her face as she contemplated getting a complete litter of puppies instead of a single dog. She yearned to be a mother, and the prospect of not being able to bear children broke her heart. Of course, we talked about other possibilities. We looked into adoption, fostering, and any other option you can think of. We were even planned to meet with an adoption agency at the time of the miracle. Frank performed the miracle. Beth became pregnant in spite of all the odds. As a result, her doctors were stumped. What seemed like an impossibility at the time became a reality when we began discussing the possibility of turning our second bedroom into a nursery and figuring out how to rearrange our work schedules so that one of us could be home with the baby at all times. About 4 months into the pregnancy, the difficulties began to arise. We were in the hospital for testing and procedures every few weeks, it seemed. Beth was fantastic throughout the entire ordeal. I acted like a complete madman, worrying about every little thing, while she sat there in the hospital bed, stroking her growing tummy and smiling to herself. Everything worked out for her, and all of her problems were merely blips on the road. Just a few days after reaching the 31-week milestone, she went into labor early. She strolled into the kitchen and announced the impending arrival of her child in a calm and matter-of-fact manner. Her calm demeanor helped her locate the bag we'd already packed weeks ago and the car keys while I rushed to get dressed and gather the few remaining essentials that hadn't yet been placed into the bag. Frank was born 6 hours after his mother gave birth. My heart sank when he emerged from the womb, because he was so tiny. The doctor and a nurse immediately moved him to a heated table, where they began to treat him. To prevent me from getting in the way, a second nurse restrained me from coming too close. Everything came to a halt, and we heard the sweetest sound, our son crying. As far as I could tell from what he saw, Frank was going to be all right despite having to spend a few weeks in an intensive care unit because of his size. To keep my balance, I had to put my hand on the bed's headboard. I was very glad. When Beth's monitor's alarm went off, my fingers had barely touched the plastic. In less than an hour, Frank and I had both lost track of her. There was nothing the hospital staff did incorrectly, and nothing could have been done to avoid the incident. Her body had broken down under the strain of labor and delivery, and she had endured a significant loss of blood. Her life was saved to the best of the staff's abilities. It was simply not feasible. Before she died, she never even had a chance to hold Frank. I was never able to express my sorrow at her passing. Now that I was a single parent, the only thing on my mind was the tiny baby in the NICU. My stint at work was followed by a night at Frank's hospital where I stayed until he was well enough to leave the hospital. I was hired by a new company not long before he was freed. Despite the lower pay, I was able to work from the comfort of my own home. I had to be there for him at all times because he didn't have much of a family support system. In the end, it had just been me and him. We made an incredible child together, and I wish Beth could see him now. He's a joy to be around, a pain to deal with, and so much more. We couldn't have asked for anything more from him. I didn't believe him at first when he said he was being visited by something in the middle of the night because his imagination is so vivid for his age. It took some time, but we finally established a nightly routine. At the end of the evening, when Frank has had his bath and gone to bed, we have dinner together and then spend approximately an hour running around the house or outside depending on the weather. Every parent knows that routines aren't infallible, but this one should be done by 8 p.m. every night. On the first night he came to visit, I was unable to get him to bed until nearly 9 o'clock. When I heard Frank shout for me, I was working away at my desk, trying to catch up on some things. Shame on me for feeling irritated as soon as I heard it. Every time he made that kind of noise, it was to ask for a last drink of water or to express his displeasure at not being able to sleep. A couple of times a week is about right. That's not what I meant when I claimed that I had an exceptional child, but rather one who was prone to the typical 4-year-old behaviors. That's when I got to my feet and shoved my chair back hard enough that it fell over. His voice was filled with anxiety. When I reached the second story, I dashed up the short flight of stairs and slammed his door open, my fingers reaching for the switch. Frank's eyes welled up as he sat in his bed, sobbing. Left leg of his pajamas was raised and hands were pressed down on the skin of his lower thigh. It appeared like his bed linens and comforter had been discarded. His pillow was dangling precariously over the edge of the bed. This bed safety rail had already been installed, so I crouched down next to it and put it in place before hurrying to his side. After that, he wrapped his arms around my neck and began to sob even more fiercely. He was crying so hard that he was coughing uncontrollably. For his own safety, I peeled him away from me and placed him in my lap. It took me a long time to comfort him as he sobbed and sniffed inconsolably while I stroked his hair. I sat him on the edge of his bed and removed his hands off his leg when he finally calmed down. It had 3 long scuffs going along its length. There were a few little beads of blood in the wounds, but they weren't deep. So, I softly inquired, what happened? He kept his mouth shut. The second time I questioned him, he raised his head and looked me in the eyes. In a whisper, he confessed, "Nighty-night harmed me." I couldn't understand why he was looking at me. When he finally said, "I don't know," I had no idea what to anticipate. "What time is it?" I inquired, my voice low. "Do you remember what I tell you before you go to bed at night?" "Nighty-night," Frank said again, this time more emphatically. He rubbed against me. The wicked cat did it, too. He'd been scratched by a neighbor's kitten just after his 3rd birthday while trying to play with it. Although the claws had even pierced the skin, the memory of the experience lingered on in his mind. My apologies to the huge guy, but I'm stumped. Nighty-night is a cat, are you saying? There will be no cat. Daddy, your daughter is a monster. I was hurt by him. I re-examined the scratches on my skin. These events were clearly real, but they were also clearly not the work of a monster. Another event had occurred. To be clear, I never doubted Frank's honesty at any point during our conversation. Despite the fact that he was prone to the occasional lie, he never lied to me about anything serious. In any case, he was too terrified to invent something. In the bathroom, I snatched Frank into my arms and retrieved a first aid kit from a cupboard. During the process of putting him in my lap, I mentally smacked my forehead and sighed. I've been forgetting to cut his fingernails when I give him a bath for the past few nights. In his sleep, he must have scratched himself. In his half-asleep state, he must have regarded it as a creature attacking him. Before clipping his nails with a small silver clipper, I hastily dressed his wounds. I gave him a hug and carried him back to his room after he calmed down. To my surprise, he clung to me so firmly when I tried to put him to bed that I almost fell forward. During that particular night, he flatly refused to sleep in his own bed. We ended up sleeping together downstairs, and he was back to his normal self by the time the sun came up. It appeared as if the previous night's events had vanished into thin air. To make the most of the weekend, I took Frank out to a nearby state park. It was a fun-filled day of playing on the playground and splashing about in the lake. We were both fatigued by the time we left the park and made our way home. While driving to the house, he fell asleep in his car seat. I brought him into the house and up to his bedroom. During the entire procedure, he remained unconscious. Let him sleep for about an hour or so, I had originally intended on doing. Because he still needed to eat dinner, I was aware that it would be nearly impossible to put him to sleep if he slept too long. I took off my shoes and sat down in a chair to enjoy the silence. There wasn't a long pause in the conversation. Frank's screams broke it. Unlike the previous night, there was no yelp or weeping. Intense pain and terror fueled this cry. I ran up the stairs and rushed into his room, yelling his name as I went. Angry Frank was slumped over on the floor with a swollen eyeball and his thumb in his mouth. Slowly, he swung his hips back and forth. It appeared to him that he was aware that I was present, but that my presence had no bearing on him. The sensation of a moist and warm sensation on my hand as I scooped him up surprised me. The blood on my fingers was evident as soon as I yanked it away from his back. Once again, I carried him to the bathroom and turned on the light. As soon as I caught a glimpse of his back in the sink mirror, I felt as if ice were being poured into my veins. His clothing had been ripped to shreds, and the ones that were left were stained scarlet from the blood. I plopped Frank down on the counter and threw him the shirt. At one point, I questioned aloud if he was in shock because he remained completely silent during the procedure. The 3 cuts on his back were spaced about the same distance apart as the scrapes on his leg. These, on the other hand, went far deeper and were bleeding profusely. Before returning to the car, I wrapped his wounds as quickly as possible. My rudimentary knowledge of first aid couldn't handle the damage. He urgently required the services of a medical professional. We were in agony as we made our way to the hospital. I tried to alleviate the pressure on his back by patting his car seat with a blanket, but he began to scream in agony as soon as we started driving. Despite the fact that I knew it was against the law, I stopped, unbuckled him, and sat him sideways in the passenger seat before getting back in and continuing to drive. Maybe I should have reconsidered. I don't know for sure. The only thing I know for sure is that I couldn't bear to watch him in such pain. When the nurse at the emergency room desk spotted Frank's back through the window, she instantly waved us in. When she left, I placed him on a neighboring gurney while I went to get a doctor. The best I could do was hold him and tell him that everything was going to be well. I gave him a comforting smile and said, "I know it hurts, little man, but I have to ask you something." "What's going on?" "A matter of fact, nighty-night," he replied instantly in a calm tone of voice. I was hurt by nighty-night. I was pressed for time and couldn't ask him any more questions. One look at Frank's back by the doctor was all it took for her to order a nurse to wheel him into an adjacent examination room. After I arrived, the doctor advised that I should wait outside. As she spoke, I saw that her gaze had shifted away from me and toward a security guard stationed at the other end of the hallway. I would have understood what was going on if I had been paying attention, but I was too preoccupied with Frank's safety to pay attention to what that look meant. As the nurse exited the room, the doctor entered the room. My arm was resting comfortably in hers as she walked me away from the front entrance. Of course, I objected, but she was clear that before I could see Frank, I needed to accompany her and answer a few questions. There were no pets or animals in the house, so she began by asking if there were any. She then inquired as to whether or not we had been alone when he was injured. We hadn't, so when I told her, she asked whether I'd had anything to drink that day. That was the moment when I realized what was going on and started paying attention. Staff at the hospital were attempting to figure out whether or not I had damaged my son. Our chat was interrupted by the arrival of a gray-suited man who stood next to us. It was his job to make sure that Frank was cared for in the greatest possible way, he said to them. I tried my best to answer his inquiries, but I knew he wasn't really buying what I was saying. Having no understanding what had transpired, I was unable to inform him. One of my injuries had been small enough for bandaging, but the other 2 were deep enough that I needed stitches, which the doctor informed me of once he returned from the operating room. It would be an understatement to say that I was enraged. I had no problem with her doing what was necessary for her health. I was enraged that I hadn't been allowed to be in the room with him to console him the entire time. Even as I screamed, she stood calmly by and told me that she was recommending that Frank spend the night at the hospital for observation. With a deep breath, I gently inquired about the possibility of staying with him. Neither she nor the social worker responded. He explained to me in a calm and collected manner that due to the severity of Frank's injuries, he was going to keep him with him the rest of the night while he investigated. His statements may have had a polite and measured tone, but their meaning was apparent. "You think that I wounded Frank?" I screamed, trying to fight off a second surge of rage that was brewing inside of me. There is no way I could ever do something to harm my son. If you think for a second that I'll be letting you off the hook for even a second. "Social worker, that's enough," she yelled, shutting me off. "This has to be the end of it for you. I haven't decided whether or not I believe you did it. In my experience, I've met a lot of abusive fathers, and I don't think that's how I describe you. However, I must adhere to a set of rules and regulations. We can put this behind us and move on with our lives if you go home, get some sleep, and allow me to do my job." I'd been taken by surprise by what he'd done. I kept my gaze fixed on his for a long time before finally nodding. Any deviation from his instructions would put my life in danger, and while the prospect of spending another night apart from Frank made me sick, the prospect of him being taken away forever was far worse. He rubbed my arm after I nodded one more. Before entering the examination room, he instructed me to return the next day and inquire for him at the counter. I could definitely hear Frank's voice as he opened the door and called out for me. My entire world seemed to be on fire when I walked out of the hospital. I rushed back to Frank's room as soon as I got home. I vowed to find out what had happened to him and get to the bottom of it. His sleep-induced scratches on his leg might be explained, but the injuries on his back were a different story. There's no way that he could have gotten to that part of his body. Even if he could, he would not have been able to make such deep marks. Another event had occurred. In my quest for information, I tore apart his room. If I hadn't observed the broken piece of bed or the protruding object in the toy, I would have missed the loose screw or nail. I went through the entire room, from top to bottom, and found nothing. No results were found. I couldn't locate anything that could have been the cause of his injuries. I slipped down the floor as I slumped against the wall in defeat. I leaned over and picked up a tiny stuffed duck that had caught my notice. Despite the fact that its yellow linen had faded, I could still recognize it as the first toy Beth had purchased for Frank. After we learned that she was expecting, we went out to dinner. Her pet's name was Mr. Quackers. For a duck with such a ridiculous name, it's fitting. I began to fall asleep as the day's events caught up with me. With each beat of my heart, I could feel my eyelids getting heavier. I thought this was a fantastic idea, and it was. After a good night's rest, I'd head to the hospital as soon as the sun came up. That's when I caught a glimpse of the ominous figure lurking in the room's far corner. It appeared out of nowhere, its enormously long gray body bending down and pushing against the ceiling as it pushed upwards. For a creature of its size, its limbs were incredibly long and slender. The 3 needle-like fingers on each arm must have reached a distance of 3 feet or more from the hands. The creature's face was visible as it drooped from its long neck. With dry, chapped lips that were missing bits here and there, it smiled wide to show off its pearly whites. The dried yellow collar of ancient parchment covered the areas that would have been white on a person's lidless eyes. Streams of blood from its mouth fell to the ground as it observed me. A raspy, nighty-night emitted the beast. The moment I regained consciousness, every muscle in my body twitched with excitement. In the blink of an eye, the thing had vanished without a trace. The ichor splatters on the floor had completely disappeared. My heart was beating and my breath was coming in short bursts as I sat there on the floor, all by myself in the room. I may have tried to explain what I'd seen to myself. A trick of light that my nearly unconscious mind had turned into a terrifying vision would have been a simple enough sell to convince myself that I was hallucinating. That was a logical explanation, to say the least. Seeing it was the problem. When I realized what had happened, I was certain it was real. There was no doubt in my mind about it. My gut told me that it had just been in the opposite corner from where I was standing seconds before. As a knowledge dawned on me, my terror subsided and I felt sick to my stomach. In fact, Frank had also seen it. With that horrifying expression on its face, it had watched over my 4-year-old son. As a result, he'd been injured not once, but twice. I couldn't imagine how terrified he must have been if I was this terrified. In the wee hours of the morning. Nighty-night was the nickname given by Frank. Something told me that he had heard what it had told me. It was time to leave the room, so I rose from my knees and slammed the door behind me. After a brief pause in the corridor, I dashed to the bathroom and puked in the toilet. It continued on for a long time, and I began to worry when it would end. At that point, I was near to passing out, and I collapsed against the bathtub. Frank's room shook with a loud bang. I managed to raise my chin and peer through the bathroom doorway as best I could. To my surprise, I saw the bedroom doorknob begin to turn as soon as I focused my gaze on it. The door slowly swung open with an audible click. As it grinned at me, Nighty-Night's face filled up a good portion of the entryway to my room. However, I was too weak from having vomited to stand. Only Nighty-Night's head could be seen pressing against the wooden frame. It couldn't fit through the door since it was so huge. Only a brief respite from the stress of the situation brought me relief. Nighty-Night pushed its head even more ferociously. Slowly, but surely, its head pushed its way through. As though rubber were being driven through a hole, that's how it felt to witness. Nighty-Night, it grumbled, its words coming out garbled through the tight lips. I had no choice but to leave, and I had to do it fast. Increasingly, the monster's head was making its way out of the chamber, and it wouldn't be long before it was free of its restraint. I forced myself to rise despite my aches and pains. My mind raced, and I was on the verge of collapsing, but I managed to hang on just barely. His face was nearly inside the threshold as of this writing, Nighty-Night. Inadvertently, I made my way into the corridor, where I huddled against the wall directly opposite the monster. Its hot breath stinging my face as I moved past it, I tried to be as cautious as possible. My body was only a few inches away from its teeth. As soon as I got it through the narrow doorway, I dashed down the flight of stairs. The final step tripped me up. It didn't knock me off my feet, but it was enough to send me tumbling forward before I fell over the couch's edge. One of the armrests hit my skull. I'm assuming I passed out. To my surprise, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of a knock on the door. After sitting up on the couch, I was met with the worst headache of my life. The knocking went on and on. Someone was knocking on the front door, and it took me a few seconds to realize who it was. Before I realized what had happened, I'd already taken 2 steps toward the door. When I peered up the stairs, I didn't see Nighty-Night making its way down the corridor toward me. I made my way over to the front door and opened it, still a little dizzy and unsure of what else to do. There was a huge police officer on the other side. He had a clipboard tucked under his arm and a pen in his other hand. His gaze was fixed on me, but he didn't smile. When he inquired about my name, I promptly provided it. As a social worker from the hospital requested, he arrived at my house and asked to see my son's room. I made room for him in the house by stepping aside. I walked him up the stairs and shut the door behind him. Frank's return was at stake if I didn't agree with his order to travel to the 2nd level, something I didn't want to do after what I'd been through. I led him to the open bedroom door and ushered him inside with me. Of course, Night-Night was absent. The officer drew the clipboard from his sleeve and asked me a few questions, which I answered as best I could. My conversation with him was interrupted by him scribbling some notes on a piece of paper. He then got down on one knee and examined the safety rails that ran along the sides of Frank's bed after he seemed happy with my answers. "Since you brought your youngster to the hospital," the officer inquired, "have you done anything in this room?" When he asked what I had done, I replied, "I looked around to see what had happened." "Okay, but have you changed the sheets or anything?" "What? No. I just rearranged everything and returned them to their original locations. There was no fresh linen in the room." The staff nodded in agreement. In the end, it appears that Mr. Sanders was correct. "Is that you, Mr. Sanders?" "I'm the social worker assigned to your son. See what I mean? In spite of the lack of blood on the sheets, the safety rail has a few streaks of red paint. The poles on the train line up with them. Mr. Sanders believes that your son slipped over the rail while trying to get out of bed. The poles must have pierced him through the fabric at the proper angle. By the way, he's a cutie." A few hours into the night, his back started to hurt, and he complained he was exhausted. From there, Sanders put the pieces together. What I was hearing was completely out of character for me. Frank's statements had been misunderstood, and the theory was inaccurate. Blood trails and rail poles spacing were merely a coincidence. However, it was all working out in my favor. He went on to say, "Good thing too. In the absence of his discovery or my discovery of evidence to the contrary, I believe we would be having a very different discussion right now." The officer left the scene and returned to his vehicle, appearing to be content with the outcome. Through the window, I observed him get out of the car and head down the street. The robins in the front yard tree were chirping as the sun began to rise over the trees. I figured it wouldn't be too late to make the trip to the hospital to pick up my son. As it turned out, everything went much more smoothly than I had anticipated. Afterwards, A social worker brought me to a patient room on the other side of the hospital where I filled out a few forms to ensure that my remarks were recorded. As soon as he'd opened the door for me, Frank ran up to me barefoot, waving his medical gown in the air, and virtually leapt into my arms. The white bandages on his patched wounds were visible, so I held him back with tenderness. I was crying and he was telling me about his stint in the hospital as we stood there for what seemed like an eternity. It's been 2 months since then. Although it hasn't been on the market for very long, the house where I raised Frank is currently for sale, and my agent tells me that there are a number of people interested. She refers to it as a seller's market. It has been more than a year since that fateful night, and I've only returned twice to retrieve our stuff and store them. Both occasions occurred in the middle of the day, and I made plans for Frank to stay with someone else rather than accompany me. At a hotel on the other side of town, we've been making our home. Long term, I envision us relocating as far away from here as possible, potentially even to the shore. As far as possible, I wish to keep us from this location. In the local newspaper last week, I heard about an officer who had killed his wife. He allegedly claimed that a gigantic creature emerged in his chamber as he was about to drift off to sleep one night. He had pulled out his gun from his nightstand and fired 5 rounds at the target. But his wife, who had just walked into the room, was shot by 2 bullets and died nearly immediately. Of course, no one took him seriously. They couldn't possibly have done that. It was a ridiculous rumor to begin with. Before any formal accusations were brought against him, a psychological evaluation was required since he appeared to be telling the truth. His body was discovered in his cell 3 days later. Decapitated, to be sure, but not quite. The cops are at a loss for explanations. He couldn't have done it to himself because he was the only one in his cell. They suspect that one of the other inmates gained entry and carried out the attack. In prison, former cops don't have many pals. Just how a prisoner could get into the cell and wreak so much damage without anyone noticing is beyond their comprehension. My house had been visited by the same officer. I'm aware of what transpired. Almost occurred to both my son and me. On a nighty night like this. I believe I found out how the thing appears and disappears. Both times I saw it, I was on the edge of collapsing. 2 out of the 3 times, I was on the verge of dozing off. I was fine when I actually blacked out. According to the officer's statement, he spotted the creature in his room as he was about to go off to sleep. During the small pause between waking and falling asleep, I believe nighty-night exists. You'll be able to see it when you get there. And it'll be able to glance back at you as well. Or perhaps I'm mistaken and it's always there, watching and waiting for the brief moment when your world and its are joined to come for you. I'm stumped. I don't know everything. I don't think I will ever be able to. However, it doesn't matter whether we knew exactly what Frank had been through. I won't ask him about it. Now that his wounds have healed, I'm not going to relive painful experiences that could only harm him. Everything, natural or otherwise, should be kept out of his reach. He's already been through a lot. This is not going to be the end for him, I'm afraid. While I was watching him sleep in our hotel room, I fell asleep in the chair in the corner of the room. Suddenly, something sounded out of the window to my right as I was ready to exit the building. I recognized it right away, even though it seemed like it was coming from a long way away. In the pitch black, a raspy voice shouted out, "Nighty-night." I woke up in the middle of the night and promptly got up to begin collecting our belongings, making sure not to disturb Frank. He was exhausted and in desperate need of a nap. Our time on the road was going to be extensive.